In this commentary, we're going to cover some recent revelations of Lucas and the sequel trilogy. Now, I've already done some work on researching Lucas's sequel trilogy. I'm going to briefly summarize that, and then we're getting into the alleged new revelations with Paul Duncan. Duncan has done a lot of books on the films. Now, I'm familiar with his work with Kubrick. We're not covering that, but that's sort of his background. He's done a few number of books on films, and ironically, the book in question is actually on the prequels. But apparently managed to get a hold of some information behind the scenes that is relevant to the sequel trilogy. So very briefly, this is what we know in broad strokes with what Lucas planned. He was going to concentrate on the midichlorians, he was going to concentrate on the wills, and Luke was involved, but he was planned to be killed off. He's a very disgruntled, disillusioned Jedi. He meets a much younger female Jedi. Various names were used: Kira, Twinkie, so on and so forth, Taryn. Eventually, of course, they turned her into Rey. And generically, some other things happened that did occur in the Disney trilogy. But as far as I remember, there was really no major role for Leia or some of the other revelations, which we'll get into right now. So what is it that Duncan is sharing that we didn't know before? Well, there's one or two major things that, as far as I know, we didn't know before. One is that Darth Maul was going to be essentially the main villain for the trilogy. And the way Lucas had spoken before, there wasn't even going to be really a hero-villain story. It was just going to be concentrating on sort of the new state of affairs with the Republic and how people were dealing with the aftermath. But apparently there was a much more traditional structure, and Darth Maul was going to be the head of a kind of criminal organization. And Lucas's word, a godfather, and Leia was going to deal with that. Leia in the sequel trilogy under Lucas was going to be the leader of the New Republic. That I don't think is much of a revelation. We kind of knew that. And she doesn't play the identical role in the Disney trilogy, but it's very similar to sort of being the political/military leader. But Lucas specifically said she was going to be the chosen one. So whereas the prequels had Anakin as the chosen one in the prophecy, now it's going to be Leia. So that's a major shift that's not, as far as I know, been previously reported. So we have really two things: Maul being the main villain and Leia being the chosen one. And there's some more details to add. For instance, Darth Maul will have an assistant called Darth Talon, or Darth Talon, who is a female Force user on the dark side. And she's going to be helping Maul. And that sort of sets up an interesting parallel between Maul, Talon, and Leia and Rey or Kira. So that's a kind of interesting thing that's lacking in the Disney trilogy. And additional thing is that yes, Luke was going to be killed off, but apparently Luke was going to help train Leia, and that's how she gains all these new Force abilities and powers with which to deal with Maul. Now, some of this does confirm my earlier reporting, but it does sort of contradict it a little bit, as well as some of what Lucas has been saying now, where he concentrates on the midichlorians and the wills. Let me describe the wills briefly, and then try to tie it in all together. The wills are essentially these cosmic entities, and they've actually been in Star Wars from the very beginning. The original title for Star Wars, in fact, was Journal of the Wills, the Star Wars. So Star Wars was always considered basically a very small story that the wills were telling to us. Now, before, the wills were sort of these very omnipotent, omniscient beings, but later Lucas turned them into these kind of very tiny, one-celled organisms. They're still incredibly powerful, and they influence the Force. And in the original version of Revenge of the Sith, they were going to be in the movie explicitly, but he cut the scene out. But if you go to the original script, he does mention them. Now, ironically, Disney has already made the wills canon. If you've seen Rogue One, you'll know that a major character actually says that he is a discipline of the wills. So the wills has been used already, but obviously Lucas planned to use them in his own specific way. So what do we learn? One is that the Coppola influence, which I've been noting in Dracula and The Godfather, shows up again. So my own reporting has sort of been very much ahead of the curve than other people. Now, why exactly there's such a strong Coppola influence in this sequel trilogy, as opposed to the prequels or the original trilogy, that I don't know, but it does seem like Coppola was a much more greater influence than we would have supposed. Another thing is, of course, that this is a much more female-centric Star Wars than a lot of people who have been critics of the Disney trilogy have been able to answer. Usually the criticism is that this is turning the Force into a kind of gender by focusing too much on female characters, but apparently this was always the plan with Lucas, so there really isn't much of a major shift from the Disney trilogy to the Lucas trilogy. In fact, structurally, this is actually basically the same story. They bring back an old villain, Leia is central, but presumably the person who redeems the universe, it's a little different, it's Leia, not Rey, but it is a kind of female Force user who uses her power to bring back balance to the Force. So I'm only going to stick here to the description of these new plans. I'll do a commentary judging what is good and bad about them, but it's interesting structurally how very similar the Disney trilogy and Lucas trilogy ultimately are, at least in broad strokes. Alright, this has been Star Wars Analyzed on newest revelations with the Lucas trilogy. Thanks for listening. Please comment below. Please drop a like if you can. Please support the content on Patreon if you can. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.